Meadows was nearly catatonic the afternoon of January the 6th, basically just sitting on his couch and reading these texts that he was getting and claiming that he was doing something when he was doing nothing at all.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, what Mark Meadows knows. As we barrel toward another presidential election that looks likely to be a rematch, the 2020 vote and its tortured aftermath still loom large. One key figure in the last days of the Trump White House, not to mention the modern GOP that paved the way for it and was ultimately remade by it, was Mark Meadows. Today, the former Congressman and Trump chief of staff is seen as a wild card as prosecutions over efforts to overturn the election ramp up. New York Times reporter Robert Draper is the author of a new piece called How Mark Meadows Became the Least Trusted Man in Washington, which traces Meadows' rise from the world of North Carolina real estate to Trump's inner circle. And Draper joins us now. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So before we talk about Meadows' role in the Trump White House, let's go back like your piece does. How did he get his foothold in Republican politics?
Sure. He began, as you mentioned, as a real estate guy who actually, before he had been in real estate, rolled into the resort town of Highlands in western North Carolina in 1987. At that point, he had been a customer service guy for the Tampa, Florida Electric Company, had just gotten married a couple of years beforehand, and came in really not knowing anyone, but fell in with a group of conservative Christians who helped him get set up in a sandwich shop, then at a pizza house, and finally helped him get his real estate license and his first gig there. And he arrived in that part of North Carolina just at a point in which a housing boom was taking place, and so he became a very, very wealthy man in short order. From there, this nexus of faith and money and politics all conjoined, and he used his connections to run for elective office and won fairly handily in his first try at it in 2012, coming to Washington in January 2013.
What kind of profile did he build up in Congress? What were some of the issues that he was focused on?
Yeah, I mean, he came in as a very anti-establishment conservative, not wanting to be a backbencher, one of 435. He was resentful that then Republican House Speaker John Boehner wasn't paying him enough mind, and within the first few months of his tenure as congressman, sought to have Boehner removed. That failed. He begged forgiveness, but he still sort of chafed at the established order in the House. His second year in, he and a good friend and fellow ultra-conservative Jim Jordan of Ohio co-founded the House Freedom Caucus, sort of rump hell-no faction, as it were, that basically was bucking Republican leadership on every turn. And so his profile, apart from the occasional constructive involvement in issues to try to help, say, persecuted Christians across the world, was usually basically to thwart Republican agendas in which Obamacare was still allowed to exist, in which taxes still remained high, in which high spending bills like infrastructure were taking place. So these were the kind of obstructionist efforts that Meadows was a part of.
How did his role in the Republican Party develop to the point that he was in line to become the last Trump chief of staff?
Yeah, well, the House Freedom Caucus had been, as I say, a really hard line, hold the spending, low taxes group, but they cleverly repurposed themselves when Trump took office as a kind of populist society that was more about cultural grievances and standing up to the so-called swamp than about any sort of conservative ideology. And Meadows was very much at the head of that train, became very, very close to Trump, became a confidant of his. In fact, they would speak every night after Sean Hannity was off the air. And so when Trump was moving through one chief of staff after the next, and Meadows' good friend Mick Mulvaney was on pretty thin ice, then Meadows continued to do what he could to undermine Mulvaney so that Meadows would be next in line, which is what took place in March of 2020, resulting in Meadows being ultimately Trump's last chief of staff.
Tell us about the evolution of the Trump-Meadows relationship.
Yeah, I mean, these are guys with very little in common. Neither of them drinks, but apart from that, they're about as different as can be. Meadows had always been a conservative Christian. Trump would be hard pressed to recite a Bible verse, but Meadows recognized that Trump prized loyalty above all else, and so when Meadows took office as chief of staff, the first thing he tried to do was expose leakers within the White House to try to ingratiate himself with the president. Basically, all guardrails came off of the Oval Office at that point, and all sorts of people had unfettered access to the Oval Office because it just wasn't within Meadows to be saying no to Trump, really not to anybody. Meadows was well known on Capitol Hill, and for that matter, back in his days as a realtor in North Carolina, of telling people anything they wanted to hear that would just help smooth things through for Meadows and help him get through the day. But that's a dangerous thing for a chief of staff whose job it really is to deliver the bad news to the president. Meadows was loath to do that, and this disinclination played all the way up through the November 2020 election, when Meadows was very reluctant to lead the charge and insisting to the president that he had lost fair and square, and that it was time to move towards a peaceful transition of power.
And I should say, you're not just characterizing Meadows, based on people's experiences with him. This story has text messages that have not been published before, where he does what you say, which is, kind of have a different answer for everybody, right?
That's right, Ian. I mean, it's really kind of, it's whiplashing to read these 2,300 texts, which I managed to get a hold of, that were turned over by Meadows' attorneys to the January 6th committee, of how Meadows would say to one person who wanted Trump to keep fighting, "Oh, we will fight until the bitter end," to another person who thought that Trump should exit stage right and gracefully concede, "Oh, he will be doing this any day now." And this carried up all the way through the day of January the 6th, where Meadows is receiving texts from members of Congress who are trapped inside the Capitol owing to the riot, saying that the president's got to do something. And Meadows is writing back saying, "Oh, I'm on it. He's going to do something. We're doing something any minute now. He is doing this right now." And none of that was true, as we know really from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, his personal aide. Meadows was nearly catatonic the afternoon of January the 6th, basically just sitting on his couch and reading these texts that he was getting and claiming that he was doing something when he was doing nothing at all.
So what kind of legal exposure does Meadows have today?
Well, I mean, for one thing, he's under indictment in the Fulton County indictment relating to Trump's efforts to overturn the election results in that swing state of Georgia. But he has also been brought in to speak to the prosecuting team of Jack Smith in the federal probe of Trump that has led to the indictment last August of Trump for the January 6th related offenses. And as my story discloses, Meadows received an immunity order, which they do not hand out for free. It means, in essence, that rather than him taking the fifth before going before a grand jury, he would truthfully describe everything that he, as the right-hand man to the President of the United States, the veritable guy in the room, knew about Trump's efforts to overturn the election results. And he indeed testified before the federal grand jury, Meadows did, on March 23rd of last year for 6 hours, again, not getting by with the minimum. So in this particular area, assuming that he has spoken the truth and the whole truth, then he has no legal exposure on the federal level. He will, however, be almost certainly ostracized from the greater Trump MAGA community if indeed he's seen as a friendly witness for the prosecutors, in particular if he takes the stand, which I would imagine Meadows would do anything to avoid taking place, but he may have no choice in the matter.
So, yeah, your story makes the point that he got kind of a soft landing. He has a high-paid gig at a think tank, more or less, in Washington, and he commutes to that on a weekly basis. But given the fact that there could be a Trump renaissance, he's running for the White House again, and a lot of the figures from the first time around are still kicking around. Where would that leave Meadows if Trump is elected again?
Well, you have to understand the short history of Mark Meadows, Ian, is basically of a guy who has always managed to stay sort of one step ahead of his persecutors or his creditors, has always managed to escape the burning building, as it were. But now here's one that is truly on fire, where if he is seen as a cooperating witness, he will be reviled in Trump world. He may escape prison, but he'll have no livelihood. On the other hand, if he goes down as a kind of martyred MAGA patriot and refuses to testify or in some other way ends whatever level of assistance he's giving to Smith's prosecution team, then he could go to jail. I will tell you that Trump's loyalists with whom I've spoken are very, very leery of Meadows at this point, but they don't want to come out and excoriate him right now for fear that that will just push him into the embrace of Smith's team. They are hoping against hope that Meadows really is getting by with the absolute minimum and honoring a federal subpoena, saying as little as he possibly can. That's essentially the message that Meadows has conveyed to people in his orbit. And he still continues, as you say, to be very much a part of the far right world, being the senior partner of Conservative Partnership Institute, where he's paid nearly $900,000 a year, living in this very cushy lake house in South Carolina, and but for the most part, laying low and waiting to see if the storm of all of these judicial processes passes.
Let me ask you just about Trump here too. You know, we're pretty far into the 2024 cycle. Do you see that any of his many legal cases could stand in the way of Trump, getting the nomination and potentially winning the election and returning to the White House?
Well, certainly not stopping him from getting the nomination. The poll after poll makes absolutely clear that Republicans are largely unconcerned, at minimum, as to whether or not the former President Trump is found guilty of a crime. In fact, at maximum, a lot of them might be motivated to come out and vote for him, seeing him as someone who's been persecuted by the same American system that they feel ground down under. So, if anything, up to the general election, being all these indictments and even being found guilty may inure to Trump's benefit. Now, we've also seen a number of surveys that indicate that independents would be very turned off by the prospect of voting for a president who would be taking his oath of office from behind bars, and that may very well affect things. But I do not think that it's going to affect Trump's disposition in terms of, he'll continue to run. There will continue to be a groundswell of support in the Republican base behind him, and it remains to be seen. In the meantime, what Biden's own base of support will be. We've also seen surveys to indicate that key constituent elements of Biden's are showing indications of not turning out to vote this upcoming November at a strength level that Biden would need. So while it's hard to imagine in a general election climate these trials and potential guilty verdicts helping Trump, in the scheme of things, they may only solidify his base of support, where Biden's base of support remains tenuous.
We've been speaking with Robert Draper from the New York Times. His new article is called How Mark Meadows Became the Least Trusted Man in Washington. Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and thanks for your reporting. Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Ian. Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.